You know that moment when the person who always says yes finally says no. The world seems to stop spinning. People freeze, relationships crack, and suddenly everyone's scrambling to figure out what went wrong. Here's what most people don't realize. That moment isn't random. It's not a breakdown. It's actually one of the most psychologically significant events that can happen in any relationship dynamic. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact phenomenon, and what he discovered will fundamentally change how you see human behavior. Jung identified something he called the helper's shadow, the dark, repressed side of people who've built their entire identity around being available, understanding, and endlessly giving. For years, maybe decades, these individuals suppress their own needs, their own boundaries, their own authentic voice. They become what Jung termed wounded healers, people so attuned to others' emotional states that they lose connection with their own. But here's where it gets fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Jung observed that when these individuals finally access their suppressed boundaries, it creates what he called a collective disturbance. Everyone around them experiences a form of psychological shock because the entire relational ecosystem has been built on their endless availability. I've studied this pattern for years, and what strikes me most is how predictable the response becomes. The moment an empath establishes a boundary, three things happen simultaneously. First, people question the empath's mental state. Are you okay? This isn't like you. Second, they attempt guilt manipulation. I thought I could count on you. Third, they experience genuine panic because their emotional support system has suddenly shifted. Jung documented similar cases throughout his therapeutic practice. He worked with individuals who had spent their entire lives managing other people's emotions, and he noticed a consistent pattern. These people would come to therapy not because they wanted to stop helping others, but because they were completely exhausted and didn't understand why. One patient described feeling like they were drowning in other people's problems while simultaneously feeling guilty for wanting to surface for air. Another spoke about feeling invisible in their own life, like they existed solely to solve everyone else's issues. Jung recognized these weren't isolated cases. They represented a fundamental psychological archetype. What Jung discovered was that empaths often develop what he called negative inflation. They become so identified with their role as helper that they lose touch with their own psychological needs. Their shadow, all those suppressed desires for recognition, rest, and reciprocity, grow stronger in the unconscious until it eventually demands expression. The no isn't really a rejection, it's an integration event. It's the moment when the conscious helper personality meets the unconscious need for self-preservation. Jung called this process individuation, and he considered it essential for psychological health. Now let me share something that might challenge everything you've been told about empathy and relationships. The panic that occurs when an empath sets boundaries isn't actually about losing their help. It's about losing their function as an emotional dumping ground. People have unconsciously organized their own emotional regulation around the empath's availability. Think about this for a moment. If you've built a relationship where one person consistently handles the emotional labor, processes the problems, and maintains the peace, what happens when that person stops? The entire system has to reorganize. People are forced to confront their own emotional patterns, their own coping mechanisms, their own capacity for self-regulation. Jung observed that many people become unconsciously dependent on empaths as a way to avoid their own psychological development. Instead of learning to process their own emotions, manage their own stress, or develop their own coping strategies, they outsource these functions to the empath in their life. This creates what Jung identified as a psychological symbiosis, a relationship dynamic where one person's growth is stunted by their overfunctioning, while the other person's growth is stunted by their underfunctioning. Both parties remain psychologically incomplete. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. When an empath says no, they're not just setting a boundary, they're reclaiming their own psychological autonomy. They're refusing to continue serving as what Jung called a container for other people's unprocessed emotions. The panic response reveals something profound about human nature. It shows how many people have never learned to hold their own emotional space. They've become accustomed to having someone else regulate their feelings, manage their reactions, and provide stability when they feel overwhelmed. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon in his work on projection. People project their own capacity for emotional stability onto the empath, then become terrified when that external source of regulation is no longer available. It's like suddenly realizing you've been borrowing someone else's emotional immune system. Look, I've watched this pattern play out countless times, and there's something most people miss about what's really happening. The empath's no isn't the problem, it's the solution. It's forcing everyone in the system to develop their own emotional muscles, their own coping strategies, their own capacity for self-soothing. But here's where it gets complicated. Most empaths have been conditioned from childhood to believe their worth is tied to their usefulness. They've learned that love is conditional on their availability, their understanding, their endless patience. So when they finally set a boundary, they're not just challenging others, they're challenging their own deepest beliefs about worthiness. Jung recognized that this conditioning often begins in childhood with what he called parentification, when a child takes on adult emotional responsibilities. These children learn early that their role is to manage family emotions, keep peace, and ensure everyone else's comfort. They develop hypersensitivity to others' moods and an almost compulsive need to fix whatever seems wrong. This early programming creates adults who mistake emotional caretaking for love, who confuse their own needs with selfishness, and who feel genuinely guilty when they're not available to solve someone else's problems. Their nervous system has been trained to prioritize others' emotional states over their own. When these individuals finally say no, they're essentially reprogramming decades of conditioning. They're learning to trust that they can be loved for who they are, not just for what they provide. This process is both liberating and terrifying because it requires them to discover their authentic self beneath years of people-pleasing patterns. Now here's what makes this even more complex from a psychological perspective. The people who panic when an empath sets boundaries often have their own unresolved attachment wounds. They may have grown up with inconsistent caregiving, emotional neglect, or trauma that left them with an insecure attachment style. These individuals unconsciously seek out empaths because empaths provide the consistent, predictable emotional availability they never received in childhood. The empath becomes their secure base, their emotional regulator, their source of stability in an otherwise unpredictable world. When that source of security suddenly establishes boundaries, it triggers their deepest fears of abandonment and rejection. Their nervous system interprets the boundary as a threat to their survival, which explains the intensity of their panic response. Jung understood that these dynamics create what he called unconscious contracts in relationships. One person agrees to be endlessly available in exchange for feeling needed and valued. The other person agrees to be emotionally dependent in exchange for never having to develop their own emotional skills. Both parties benefit from this arrangement in the short term, but both parties are also limited by it. The empath never learns to receive care, and the dependent person never learns to provide it. Neither develops a complete emotional skill set. The moment of no represents a breakdown of this unconscious contract. It forces both parties to renegotiate the terms of their relationship based on mutual respect and genuine reciprocity rather than codependent patterns. Here's something that will probably resonate deeply. Most empaths report feeling terrified the first time they set a significant boundary. They expect rejection, abandonment, and anger. And honestly, they often get all three, at least initially. But Jung observed something fascinating about what happens next. After the initial shock and resistance, relationships begin to reorganize around healthier dynamics. People who truly care about the empath learn to respect their boundaries and develop their own emotional skills. Those who can't make this adjustment often fade from the empath's life naturally. This process, while painful, serves as a natural filter. It reveals which relationships were based on genuine connection and which were based on utilitarian exchange. It shows who truly sees the empath as a person versus who only valued their function. Jung called this the individuation crisis, the moment when someone chooses their authentic self over their adapted self, even when that choice disrupts existing relationships. He considered this one of the most important psychological developments a person can make. But let me be clear about something. The goal isn't to turn empaths into boundary-setting machines who never help anyone. That would be just as unbalanced as having no boundaries at all. The goal is integration, developing the ability to choose when to give and when to preserve, when to help and when to step back. Jung wrote about this as achieving what he called conscious compassion, the ability to help others from a place of choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than depletion, from strength rather than codependency. When empaths learn to set boundaries, they don't become less caring. They become more effective in their caring. They help from a place of genuine choice rather than unconscious programming. They offer support without sacrificing their own well-being. This shift benefits everyone involved. The empath maintains their energy and emotional health. The people around them are challenged to develop their own emotional intelligence and coping skills. Relationships become more balanced and sustainable. Now, let me paint you 3 scenarios that demonstrate exactly how this plays out in real life, because I want you to see these patterns clearly. First scenario, the workplace empath. This is the person who stays late to help colleagues, who never says no to additional projects, who becomes the unofficial therapist for everyone's work stress. They've built their professional identity around being indispensable. The moment they start leaving on time, declining non-essential meetings, or suggesting others handle their own workplace conflicts, the office dynamic shifts dramatically. Colleagues who relied on their emotional labor suddenly have to manage their own stress. Managers realize they've been unconsciously over-assigning work to their most reliable person. The initial response is often confusion and resistance. Are you looking for another job? Is everything okay at home? You seem different lately. What's really happening is that everyone's having to adjust to a new reality where this person is no longer functioning as the office emotional support system. But here's what's fascinating about Jung's observations on workplace dynamics. He noticed that when one person stops over-functioning, it creates space for others to step into leadership roles, develop problem-solving skills, and take ownership of their own professional development. The workplace actually becomes more psychologically healthy when emotional labor is distributed rather than concentrated in one person. Second scenario, the family empath. This is the adult child who feels all the family drama, who mediates sibling conflicts, who remembers everyone's birthdays and organizes all gatherings. They've become the family's emotional center of gravity. When they start declining to mediate conflicts, reducing their availability for crisis management, or expecting others to contribute to family organization, the entire family system gets disrupted. Parents who relied on them to manage sibling relationships suddenly have to address conflicts directly. Siblings who use them as an intermediary have to communicate with each other. The family often responds with guilt-inducing messages about family loyalty, responsibility, and how they're not the person they used to be. What's really happening is that everyone's having to develop skills they've avoided developing because the empath was handling everything. Jung wrote extensively about family systems and how they resist change even when that change would benefit everyone involved. He observed that families often designate one member as the identified helper, the person responsible for maintaining emotional stability. When that person steps back, the family is forced to develop what he called distributed emotional intelligence. This process, while initially chaotic, ultimately creates stronger family bonds because it's based on each person contributing their emotional skills rather than relying on one person to manage everything. Third scenario, the romantic relationship empath. This is the partner who anticipates needs, manages emotions, and maintains relationship harmony by consistently accommodating and adjusting. They've made their partner's comfort their primary responsibility. When they start expressing their own needs, expecting emotional reciprocity, or refusing to manage their partner's emotional reactions, the relationship dynamics shift fundamentally. The partner who relied on their emotional regulation suddenly has to develop their own emotional skills. The partner often responds with accusations of selfishness, threats about the relationship's future, or attempts to recreate the old dynamic through guilt or manipulation. What's really happening is that one person is refusing to be responsible for two people's emotional well-being. Jung studied romantic relationships extensively and identified what he called psychological marriage, a relationship where both partners support each other's individuation process. He distinguished this from dependency marriage, where one person's psychological development is sacrificed to maintain the other's comfort. When empaths set boundaries in romantic relationships, they're essentially inviting their partner into psychological marriage. They're saying, I want us both to be whole people who choose each other, not incomplete people who need each other to function. In each of these scenarios, the panic response reveals the same thing. People have organized their lives around the empath's endless availability. When that availability changes, everyone has to reorganize. Here's what I find most interesting about Jung's perspective on this phenomenon. He didn't see the panic response as malicious or intentionally manipulative. He understood it as an unconscious attempt to restore psychological homeostasis. People resist change in relationship dynamics the same way they resist change in any other area of life. The familiar pattern, even if unhealthy, feels safer than the unknown territory of a new dynamic. The panic is often genuine fear of losing something they've come to depend on. But Jung also recognized that this resistance, while understandable, often prevents everyone involved from growing. When empaths continue accommodating the panic by abandoning their boundaries, they enable others to avoid developing emotional independence. The healthiest response to an empath's boundary setting isn't panic, it's curiosity. Questions like, how can I better support you, or what do you need from me, indicate someone who's willing to adjust and grow rather than simply trying to restore the old pattern. Look, after years of studying this dynamic, I can tell you that the most successful relationship transformations happen when everyone involved recognizes the boundary setting as an opportunity for growth rather than a threat to be eliminated. Jung believed that healthy relationships require what he called mutual individuation, both parties continuing to develop their authentic selves while maintaining connection. This requires each person to take responsibility for their own emotional well-being while supporting their partner's growth. When empaths set boundaries, they're essentially saying, I want our relationship to be based on mutual respect and reciprocity rather than me managing your emotional world. This invitation to deeper connection often gets misinterpreted as rejection. The people who can make this transition, who can see the boundary as an invitation to deeper intimacy rather than a threat to be overcome, these are the relationships that not only survive but thrive. They become stronger, more authentic, and more sustainable. Those who can't make this transition, who continue demanding the old pattern of endless availability, often find themselves naturally filtering out of the empath's life. This isn't because empaths become cold or uncaring, it's because they finally recognize the difference between connection and consumption. Now let me dive deeper into what Jung called the psychological mechanics of this boundary-setting process, because understanding the deeper layers will help you navigate this territory more effectively. Jung identified that empaths often experience what he termed boundary anxiety, a deep fear that setting limits will result in abandonment or rejection. This anxiety stems from early conditioning, where their worth was tied to their availability and helpfulness. This conditioning creates what Jung called a false self, a personality structure built around meeting others' needs rather than expressing authentic desires. The empath learns to read emotional environments with extraordinary accuracy and adjust their behavior to maintain harmony, often at the expense of their own emotional truth. When an empath begins setting boundaries, they're essentially challenging this false self-structure. They're choosing authenticity over approval, which triggers what Jung called individuation anxiety, the fear that comes with stepping into your true self when that self might not be as universally accepted as your adapted self. Jung observed that this anxiety is actually a positive sign. It indicates that the person is moving towards psychological wholeness, rather than remaining stuck in patterns that serve others, but diminish themselves. But here's where it gets really interesting from a depth psychology perspective. Jung noticed that empaths often have what he called shadow guilt, unconscious guilt about having needs, wants, and limitations. This guilt was typically installed in childhood through messages that their needs were burdensome, selfish, or less important than others' needs. When empaths start setting boundaries, this shadow guilt gets activated. They feel guilty for saying no, guilty for having limits, guilty for not being endlessly available. This guilt can be so intense that many empaths abandon their boundaries before they've had a chance to establish them. Jung worked with patients to understand that this guilt isn't based on current reality. It's based on childhood programming that served to keep them in a helpful role, but prevented them from developing emotional autonomy. The process of overcoming shadow guilt requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel temporary discomfort in service of long-term psychological health. This means sitting with the guilt feelings without acting on them, allowing them to exist without letting them dictate behavior. Jung also identified what he called the individuation crisis that occurs when empaths first start setting boundaries. This crisis involves a temporary period of relationship instability as everyone adjusts to new dynamics. During this crisis period, empaths often experience increased conflict, guilt-inducing messages from others, and pressure to return to their previous patterns. Jung saw this as a natural part of the growth process, the psychological equivalent of a fever that indicates the immune system is fighting off infection. The key insight Jung offered was that this crisis period is temporary, but only if the empath maintains their boundaries consistently. If they give in to the pressure and abandon their limits, they reinforce everyone's belief that the boundaries weren't serious and that enough pressure will restore the old patterns. Jung encouraged his patients to view this crisis period as psychological labor, similar to physical labor in childbirth. It's intense and uncomfortable, but it's producing something valuable, a new way of relating that's based on authentic choice rather than unconscious programming. Now, let me share something that Jung discovered about the deeper motivations behind people's panic when empaths set boundaries. It's not just about losing emotional support. It's about confronting their own avoided emotional development. Jung observed that many people unconsciously use empaths as what he called psychological crutches, external supports that allow them to avoid developing internal emotional strength. When the empath withdraws this support, these individuals are forced to confront their own emotional immaturity. This confrontation often triggers what Jung called regression anxiety, the fear of being emotionally overwhelmed because they lack sufficient internal resources to handle their emotional life independently. Rather than acknowledging this anxiety and using it as motivation to develop emotional skills, many people instead try to pressure the empath back into their supportive role. They'd rather restore the old dynamic than do the work of developing emotional independence. Jung understood this response as a natural resistance to growth, but he also recognized that accommodating this resistance prevents everyone involved from reaching their psychological potential. The empaths who successfully maintain their boundaries during this period often report that their relationships eventually become much stronger and more fulfilling. People who initially panicked learn to develop their own emotional skills and become more capable partners, friends, and family members. Those who can't make this adjustment often reveal that their connection to the empath was primarily utilitarian rather than genuinely caring. This realization, while painful, allows the empath to invest their energy in relationships that offer real reciprocity. Jung also noticed that empaths often need to develop what he called tolerance for others' discomfort. Many empaths abandon their boundaries not because they can't handle their own feelings, but because they can't handle other people's emotional reactions to their limits. Learning to maintain boundaries while others are upset requires developing what Jung termed emotional differentiation, the ability to care about someone without being responsible for managing their emotional reactions. This differentiation allows empaths to offer support and care while still maintaining their own emotional integrity. They can say things like, "I understand you're upset about my boundary, and I care about you, but I'm not going to change my limit because of your reaction." Now let me give you a framework that brings all of this together, because understanding the psychology is one thing. Knowing how to navigate it is another. Jung developed what I call the conscious boundary framework, a way of understanding and implementing healthy limits that honors both your empathic nature and your individual needs. This framework has 4 essential components that work together to create sustainable relationship dynamics. The first component is what Jung termed differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your emotions and other people's emotions. Most empaths struggle with this because they've developed such sensitive nervous systems that they literally feel other people's feelings as if they were their own. Differentiation requires developing what Jung called conscious feeling, the ability to notice when you're absorbing emotions from your environment versus experiencing your own authentic emotional responses. This isn't about becoming less sensitive, it's about becoming more discerning about which emotions belong to you. Practice this by regularly asking yourself, is this feeling mine or am I picking it up from someone else? When you feel suddenly anxious, overwhelmed, or sad, pause and consider whether this emotion started within you or if you're responding to someone else's emotional state. Jung also recommended what he called emotional archaeology, the practice of tracing your emotions back to their source. When you notice an emotional reaction, ask yourself, when did this feeling start? What was happening around me? Is this feeling proportional to my actual experience, or am I absorbing something from my environment? The second component is selective availability, the conscious choice about when, how, and to whom you offer your empathic gifts. Instead of being automatically available to everyone all the time, you develop criteria for engagement based on your own capacity and the other person's receptivity. Jung observed that empaths often give their energy indiscriminately, like leaving all the windows open in winter. Selective availability means learning to open specific windows at specific times while keeping others closed for your own emotional climate control. This might look like setting specific times when you're available for emotional support, choosing to engage with people who also offer support to you, or declining to help when you're already emotionally depleted. Jung encouraged empaths to develop what he called conscious compassion, helping others from a place of choice rather than compulsion. This involves regularly checking in with yourself about your capacity and energy levels before committing to provide support. The third component is reciprocal relationship building, actively creating relationships where emotional labor is shared rather than one-sided. This requires both asking for what you need and accepting support when it's offered. Jung noticed that empaths often have difficulty receiving care because they've learned to find their worth in giving. Reciprocal relationship building means learning to value yourself as someone worthy of receiving support, not just providing it. This involves practices like directly asking for emotional support when you need it, accepting help when it's offered instead of insisting you're fine, and expressing appreciation when others show up for you emotionally. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called vulnerability reciprocity, sharing your own struggles and challenges with trusted people rather than always being the one who listens to others' problems. The fourth component is shadow integration, acknowledging and accepting the parts of yourself that don't fit the helpful, understanding, endlessly patient image you've cultivated. This includes your anger, your frustration, your desire for recognition, and your need for rest. Jung believed that psychological health requires integrating these shadow aspects rather than continuing to repress them. When empaths deny their own needs and limitations, these denied aspects build up pressure in the unconscious until they eventually explode in unhealthy ways. Shadow integration involves practices like acknowledging when you feel resentful about always giving, expressing anger in healthy ways when your boundaries are violated, and accepting that you have limitations without feeling guilty about them. These 4 components work together to create what Jung called mature empathy, the ability to connect deeply with others while maintaining your own emotional integrity. It's empathy that enhances rather than depletes, that builds connection without sacrificing authenticity. When you implement this framework, you'll notice that your relationships begin to reorganize around healthier dynamics. People who are unconsciously using you as their emotional regulator will either step up and develop their own skills or naturally distance themselves. The relationships that remain will be stronger, more authentic, and more sustainable because they're based on mutual respect rather than codependent patterns, you'll find that you can actually be more helpful to others because you're helping from a place of choice and abundance rather than compulsion and depletion. Remember, the goal isn't to stop being empathic. It's to be empathic in a way that honors both your gifts and your humanity. Your sensitivity is a strength, but like any strength, it needs to be channeled consciously rather than expressed reactively. The moment you say no isn't the moment you stop caring. It's the moment you start caring in a way that's sustainable for everyone involved. It's the moment you choose conscious compassion over unconscious consumption. And here's what I want you to understand most deeply. When people panic at your boundaries, they're not panicking at your selfishness. They're panicking at the possibility that they might have to develop the emotional skills they've been avoiding by relying on you. Your boundary setting is actually an act of love, both for yourself and for them. You're refusing to enable patterns that prevent growth, and you're creating space for everyone to develop their full emotional capacity. So if you're an empath who's been struggling with the guilt of setting boundaries, know this. Your no isn't a betrayal. It's an invitation to deeper, more authentic connection. If you're someone who relies heavily on the empath in your life, see their boundaries as an opportunity to develop skills that will serve you in every relationship you have. The panic will pass, but the growth that comes from navigating this transition consciously will last a lifetime. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self, is the most important psychological work anyone can do. When empaths set boundaries, they're not just helping themselves, they're modeling what healthy selfhood looks like for everyone around them.